This is the second lecture for Wednesday, April 8th. Let's spend some time talking about migration and dispersal and see how far we get on this in about 20 minutes. So these are two ways that animals move around. In terms of exploiting new habitats, in terms of maintaining a certain distribution, then there's three main processes that are important for populations to be able to do that, to be able to have a wide distribution, to be able to maintain that distribution. One of them is reproduction. Now, we've looked at reproduction in a number of different organisms, and so you're somewhat familiar with that anyway. The two that we're going to focus on here are also important for not just in the oceanic ecosystems, which we're focusing on for the most part, but and a lot of this migration and dispersal takes place in the oceanic habitats, so it's more appropriate here than other places. But if you're talking about organisms that are found in estuaries, there's a lot of those that migrate. If you're talking about organisms that are found in coral reefs, there's some of those migrate, not so many, but there's a huge amount of dispersal. So what is migration? There's 16 different definitions for what migration is specifically, but basically we're going to consider migration movement between two separate areas, two distinct areas. Typically, what migration is, how migration is defined, is its movement between an area where there's feeding and an area where there's reproduction. And we're going to kind of look at migration in that respect, although there's this deep scattering layer movement. It's only a couple hundred yards, a couple hundred meters, but it's in some respects it's considered the biggest migration on Earth, this daily migration. And then in terms of dispersal, I've mentioned this when we actually met in person in class. I know that I mentioned this a number of times, that this idea of producing eggs that are fertilized in the water column that turn into larvae, and those larvae becoming plankton and being moved around in the ocean by currents, especially for these invertebrates that are stuck on the rocks, invertebrates that are buried in the sand, buried in the substrate. It's a recurring theme that you see over and over and over, is this dispersal through larvae. And then when we looked at fish, we saw that there's this dispersal. There's spawning, little fertilized eggs develop into little larvae, and then these larval fish are dispersed by currents. What we didn't see this in the same way with the little planktonic larvae were higher vertebrates besides fish. Sharks, skates, and rays, they don't disperse with larvae. They have live birth, or they lay eggs. They have big young. Reptiles don't do that. Mammals don't do that. Birds don't do that. They disperse. They have patterns of dispersal, but not through spawning and not through these planktonic larvae. Either way, though, whether you're doing it as a larva or whether you're doing it as a little turtle or a bird or a shark, then there's dispersal. So you've got some offspring that moves around, and it maintains the distribution of the species. It allows the species to occupy new habitats once in a while, and that's important for species not going extinct. So we'll look at migration, and then we'll look at dispersal. And in terms of migration, you could ask the question, well, why migrate? As I said a minute ago, there's a number of different definitions of what migration actually is. You can't get everybody to agree on a single definition of migration. But if we're talking about movement of animals, marine animals in general, then we can ask this question, why do you migrate in the first place? And then we'll look at these different scales of migration, some of which people wouldn't consider true migration. They don't meet the definition that some people would hold as needing to be met in order to consider something a migration. Well, why do so many animals migrate? Why is it so common? Not just in the ocean, but on land. There's a huge amount of migration. Right now, there's all these different birds and mammals. If you're big enough to move, it's very common for animals to migrate. So we're familiar with birds that migrate, and there's a lot of birds that aren't around right now in Rhode Island, but they're going to start showing up over the next few weeks. And by the end of April, there's going to be a lot of birds that are here that migrated south for the winter. So typically, or the most common perception of what migration is, as I said, you move between an area that's very good, suitable, not just suitable, but optimal for reproduction, for the adults reproducing, feeding, there's a lot of food there, and areas that are optimal for the young being able to develop. So that's what you typically see with migration, that it's the adults that are doing the migrating. They go someplace and they give birth. They go someplace and they lay eggs. That's a good habitat for the young to develop. The young spend a certain amount of time there. Sometimes the young migrate with the adults when it's time to go. Other times they stay there. And the other place where the adults go, basically when they're not reproducing, is a place where they're going to spend the rest of their life, is a good place to feed. And so what are you getting out of this migration? You're moving one place, and it's a good place for the young. Maybe it's an abundant food for the young, or oftentimes it's a safe place for the young, offers some kind of a refuge, a reduction in predation risk. And then the other location, the other end of the migratory route, is usually some feeding site where it's good for the adults. You get a lot of food. Some adults don't eat at all when they're undergoing this migration, or when they get to the place where they're going to give birth or lay eggs, and they don't feed. The feeding place is at the other end of their journey. Well, let's look at 3 different types of migration. This first type, daily migration. As I said, some people might not even consider this migration. They'd say, that's, it's a big movement of a whole bunch of animals, but it's not really migration. Some of them aren't even animals, and it's a very short distance, and they're not moving for reproduction. Well, we'll look at daily migration. There's a huge amount of biomass that moves a short distance. Some people would say, if you consider this migration, it's the biggest migration in the world. It's the biggest amount of biomass migrating in the world, and it happens every day. Well, the migration that you probably think about more, comes to mind when you're talking about migration, is seasonal migration. That these birds, they fly up here, they lay their eggs in the springtime, and it's a good place for the young to develop. There's food for them, for the adults to feed the young. It's a low predation risk compared to other places. And then they fly south for the winter. Birds do. They migrate south for the winter. Striped bass and a lot of fish make these seasonal migrations. Turtles, whales make these migrations. Very common. And so it has to do with reproduction, but it's a trade-off between reproduction and feeding, the seasonal migration. That's very common. We're very familiar with that, I think. And that's more of what people think about in terms of what real migration is, as opposed to that daily migration. And then, since we're talking about marine biology, something specific to marine organisms is the fact that there's a number of organisms in the ocean, a number of animals, that move between freshwater and seawater. Now, that is quite a change. It's completely out of the ocean in some cases, or at least out of the full-strength seawater. That's quite a a change, and that's quite a migration. So some of those migrations are taking advantage of the productivity and the protected estuary type of habitat. Some of them, they're moving upstream where their young are going to develop a long ways away from predators, and then when they get bigger and they're less prone to predation, then they can move back into the ocean. So we're going to look at seawater freshwater migration. You could go from seawater into freshwater and reproduce, which is very common, or you can spend your life in freshwater and then migrate in the ocean to reproduce, which is less common. Or you can do something that's kind of not quite the full move from freshwater to seawater, but close. So let's look at this first one, daily migration. This deep scattering layer, if you had a sonar, if you had a depth finder on a boat and you looked, you could see this deep scattering layer. And so there's these daily migrations. This is what I talked about before, the mesopelagic. You're down in the dark during the daytime. Darkness provides some refuge from predators. They can't see you as well. It's dark. You can hide. At night, of course, it's dark up close to the surface. It's dark at the surface. So then you can move up into this better habitat, up shallower water where there's more energy, more phytoplankton, more things to eat. It's not so good for not getting eaten, but it's better for eating. So you move up into shallow water at night, and then you move back down into deeper water during the daytime. Daytime, you're deep. Nighttime, you're shallow. Back and forth, back and forth. There's a lot of different migration. There's a lot of different organisms that migrate. They're not even animals. There's protists that do this, but there's a whole bunch of animals, small animals, fish, a whole bunch of animals that do that. So that's the big migration. A huge amount of biomass moves that short distance. It's only a couple hundred meters. There's also fish, a lot of fish that move back and forth between a place where they refuge during the daytime, and then they go up in the reef flat, or they go expand their movements out at night, foraging around, because it's safer. They don't have to worry about predators as much. But then in the daytime, they go back to their daytime refuge. Now, that's not quite as large scale, although there's a lot of animals that do that in the ocean. Certainly not the degree of biomass that you find with the deep scattering layer. Now, this is what I was talking about in terms of this sonar. If you go out with the fish finder, if you look at the depth, the blue, well, there's a big arrow that says what the fish layer is, but if you look at the time of day, then, and you see these depths, there's 100 meters where the fish are in the daytime, until you get to about where that arrow, just before that arrow starts, or just before that arrow ends, it's pointing at the fish layer. You can see the daily migration. There's a huge amount of biomass that goes from 100 meters up to 80 meters, 60 meters, 40 meters. It's way up there, close to the surface. Now, if this continued on, if you had this is only probably 6 hours or so, but if you observe this over a 24-hour period, then that deep scattering layer would go back down, and it would reach a point where all these little fish and invertebrates are back down to 100 meters. And up and down they go, back and forth they go. It's only a couple hundred meters. In this case, it's only about 60 meters. There's other parts of the ocean where they might move between 400 meters in the daytime up to close to the surface, so it's maybe a 400 meter migration as opposed to 60. But there's a huge amount of organisms that make that migration, daily migration. Well, let's look at seasonal migrations. This is a very common thing you see in the summertime, or where they're breeding, or where they're giving birth, or where they're feeding. There's different conditions in different locations. So one of those, you tend to find adults. They're not doing reproducing. They're concerned about feeding, surviving. So there's a location that's good for them to do that. There's also a location that maximizes the success of the survival and the success of the young. So rather than reproducing in this place that's really good to eat, you migrate sometimes long distances to a location that's not necessarily as good for you to eat as an adult, but it's very good for your offspring to find food, avoid predators, and survive. So that is the migration. Some of these have nursery areas, some of them have breeding grounds, some of them have nesting sites, some of them have spawning sites. So that's the type of seasonal migration. You've got move from one place to another. And there's, as I said, there's a lot of animals that do this seasonal migration. We're going to see next, we're going to look at this migration between different bodies of water, freshwater and saltwater. Well, a lot of those are seasonal migrations as well, although others, they're migrations that might take place every 4 years or every couple of years, not necessarily in the spring and the fall or the summer and the winter, but in the stages of an animal's life when they reach a certain age, that 3 or 4 years old, salmon swim upstream and they spawn. A couple of years in the rivers, these little baby salmon are big enough, steelhead, trout, big enough to move out of the river and go into the ocean. So look at some of these. The salmon are really well known for their seasonal migrations. So you've got salmon that on the west coast salmon, on the Atlantic salmon don't do this, but in the seasonally migrating salmon, they swim upstream and then they spawn in the streams. And then we'll look at this in more detail when we look at these freshwater seawater movements. But look at these seasonal migrations of sockeye salmon, Chinook salmon, chum salmon, pink salmon, cove salmon, all these salmon that you can find in the store. Now, sockeye salmon is the big salmon, the bright orange salmon that you get that's very good. Pink salmon's a lot cheaper if you ever buy salmon. And so that's a good example. You've got the capelin that are making these seasonal migrations, but there's a whole bunch of fish that seasonally migrate. Striped bass, bluefish on the east coast of the U.S. are two common ones. Turtles make very long distance seasonal migrations that we looked at. Whales make big migrations. Even lobster seasonally migrate. And of course, probably the best studied and the best understood, the one maybe that we're the most familiar with, are birds, seasonal migration that birds make. And again, there's a lot of marine birds that we looked at before. So what do striped bass do? A lot of guys go out and fish for striped bass. They make these seasonal migrations. If you look at the green arrows in the springtime, the summer arrows in the fall, they migrate up to New England. And so in the summertime, you have a bunch of striped bass that everybody's out trying to catch. Rhode Island, Massachusetts, all the way up to Maine. In the fall, they start moving south. In the winter, they're down south. And so this doesn't even have to do with reproduction necessarily. If they're reproducing, then they're going into these estuaries, into Delaware Bay and Chesapeake Bay. But that's where you're going to find them in the summer up north and the winter down south. Same thing with bluefish. But let's look at some marine mammals, also very impressive in terms of their migration. On the east coast of the U.S., you've got these right whales. They move down off of Florida and Georgia and the Carolinas. In the winter, up here in the summer, right whales, there's only about 300 of those, and they know all their names and everything. If you look at the gray whales on the west coast, these migrations along the coast from Alaska down to Mexico, there's some resident gray whales off the west coast. Blue whales and humpback whales make these migrations from the poles to the equator, these long distance movements, and they go in towards the equator. That's where they give birth, and in those areas where there's the calves and they're taking care of the calves, and you can see them the cabs. You can go out whale watching in those places, warm places. And then down south by Antarctica and up north in the Arctic, then that's where they are. It's very good, very rich. All those krill in Antarctica, huge amount of food. Those type of migrations. And same thing with the blue whales. You see this equator poleward type of migrations that they make. Here in Rhode Island, everybody's familiar with lobster. Lobster is a big thing, very, very important. And so there's Rhode Island. Here's these seasonal migrations that lobster make. Now, they're not swimming 2,000 miles like whales or turtles, but these lobster make these migrations. These spiny lobster farther down south supposedly line up. They follow each other. There's a lobster highway. And if you're a lobster fisherman and you can come across this, you can find these. That's a lot of lobster you can catch. So even these invertebrates that aren't swimming, they're crawling, they're walking, basically. They make these seasonal migrations. Now, there's a lot that's not understood about these lobster. It's harder to follow the lobster, catch them, and fish for them. So their migrations might not be as easily understood as a lot of fish, birds, things that are easier to study, marine mammals. Now, there's seals and sea lions. They don't tend to make very long distance migration. They don't migrate much at all. Mostly the cetaceans and the not dolphins so much, but whales especially, big migrators. And then birds, of course. We looked at the Arctic tern. The most impressive migrator of all are birds, really. They migrate the whole span of the Earth from very far down south to very far north. So we've got the common tern all over the place. We have roseate terns all over the place in New England. They go all the way down to South America, Central America, the Caribbean in the winter, and then they come up here in the summertime. There's all these shorebirds like the red knot. They feed on horseshoe crab eggs on their way to fuel their migration. Look at the migration this little shorebird is making. They're not that big, a little bigger than a robin, and they're making these thousands of miles migration. So very, very impressive. Well, another type of migration is this movement between seawater and freshwater. So we'll save that for Friday. That'll be the last part of this open ocean topic. But it's also a very interesting aspect of migration. And there's a lot of animals, especially fish, that make these freshwater, seawater migrations. So we'll look at that on Friday.